Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. Today we are taking a look at another Shakespeare speech, again from Henry V. This speech is the "Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more." So without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? As always, we just need a little bit of backstory to sort of lay the foundation for this speech. So Henry V has gone over to France because he wants to claim the French throne for himself. And whenever the English kings went over to France, they normally landed at Calais, and they moved their way along the coast a lot of the time. So they got ports where they could bring cargo in to keep supplying the soldiers. And one of the towns they always attacked in sort of every campaign when the English went over to France was the town of Harfleur, which was highly fortified and a pivotal piece of strategy for any invading king. Where we are now, the English have been laying siege to Harfleur, and through some sorties and attacks, they have made a breach in the wall. Breach is a hole, a cutting in the wall. They've smashed it down. And you've got the English troops stood waiting to be launched into the attack. We'll come to a little bit more of this later, the interpretation. And can you imagine running into an attack where you do hand-to-hand combat? Your nerves will be jangling a bit. So Henry rides before his troops and he summons up the idea of nobility, the idea of honour and greatness for one's king and one's country and one's God, ironically, who condemns murder. But there you go. And so he gives this immense motivational speech like no one else. So let's take it bit by bit, shall we? So if you have the complete works of Shakespeare at home, go and get it off of the shelf because you'll love this. Act 3, Scene 1 is where we're at, and we're just going to break down this speech. So let's start. King Henry comes in with some of his lords and soldiers and says, "Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead." I want to read it relatively neutrally so that you can feel and put in your own interpretation. So, he uses this great device of opening a sentence with the same words that he closes the sentence. Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more. It's a beautiful emphasis. It tells us exactly what's happening at this stage in the play. The fact that he says once more means there's already been an attack and it has been repulsed. Now, in the film Henry V, in which Laurence Olivier plays Henry V's character, you see the English are fleeing and Henry's run to rally them. Now, maybe that's the case. Personally, I don't think that's what happens. That's not how I interpret it. I think they're standing waiting to attack. That there's already been a line that's gone to Harfleur, fought at the breach in the wall. So remember, that's a bottleneck. And they've been repulsed. And now, after they've fled, there's more in the lines ready to be sent forward. And Henry V is rallying them up and he's going to go with them on this charge. Do you see how he addresses them? He says, once more into the breach. Come on, let's go again. To the breach. Dear friends. In the Agincourt speech, he says, we band of brothers, for he who sheds his blood with me today shall be called my brother. And now that inspires the peasantry, the yeomanry, that they're on the side of the king. They're working shoulder to shoulder with their arms linked in brotherhood with the king, Henry. And that's why he says, once more into the breach, dear friends, once more he's imploring them. And you notice he then says, or close the wall up with our English dead. So he's saying, do not fear death. We are not ones to retreat. There's no going back. That wall that has collapsed because it's been undermined, we're going to pour into it and we're going to fight the defenders who are stood in it. And we'll keep going, even if it means so many of us die, we fill up the wall and remake the wall with our dead bodies. Do you see the earnestness, the determination that Henry has? And this is what inspires the men who follow him. His determination. He will not fail. Let's see what he says next. In peace, there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger. Stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-favoured rage. We'll stop there. So what's he saying? In peace, there's nothing so becomes a man as humility and stillness. In other words, a reservation, a lack of presumptuousness. To be still. You may have your ideas, you may wish to interrupt or argue, but nothing so becomes a man as to keep still and be humble. No presumption. But did you see what he said about war? But when the blast of war blows in our ears, imitate the tiger. So when the blast of war, that's the trumpet blast to say march, go forward. And when it blasts in our ears, good word, blasts, like a cannon. It's going to discharge a flooding forward of troops to the breach. It's a very evocative word. And when it blows in our ears, so Henry's saying, mind, the next blast, I'm coming with you. Then he says, then imitate not the reserved, polite, humble, not presumptuous or pushy character that you should be at home in peace, but now the tiger. Now, of course, a tiger, when it sees its prey or wants something, doesn't hesitate. It gets ready, and when it pounces, it goes for it. And it's savage. And, you know, it pounds and claws and wins. It's fiery. And by saying imitate the tiger, what's he also saying? You men, to me, you are tigers, the biggest of the cats. Of course, back in the medieval ages, most of them hadn't seen a tiger, but they knew it was this ferocious beast. And Henry's saying, you are as valiant and as courageous as the tiger. Nothing will hold you back. So once more into the breach. But he carries on a bit further, doesn't he? He says, stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-favoured rage. Right, so stiffen the sinews. You know, when you get ready for something, you brace. Really tense. You become rock-like in your muscles. Well, maybe I don't, but generally speaking, that's what we do. Summon up the blood. Get the heart pounding. Yeah, and the blood, of course, is a symbol of courage and determination and strength. You know, we talk about being hot-blooded. That's full of rage, full of power. And he's saying, summon up the blood. Let it become hot and begin swelling within you to move you to action. Then he says, disguise fair nature with hard-favoured rage. So, fair nature. We've got a pleasant face, a nice demeanour. If we were to meet strangers normally, you'd be, oh, how do you do? And smiling. But he's saying disguise that nature. In other words, wipe that off in favour of hard-favoured rage. A hard aspect. Merciless. Ultra-determined. And full of, since they've summoned the blood, rage. Imagine the shouting that went on in a battle. It was cathartic. It got the body ready to wreak havoc on its enemies. It's quite appalling if you were to put yourself in the position of the people in Harfleur at this time. But you see how he's getting them ready. He's stirring them, he's inciting his crowd to act. Now look what he says next. Really good this is. Then lend the eye a terrible aspect. Let it pry through the portage of the head like the brass cannon. Let the brow o'erwhelm it as fearfully as doth a gold rock overhang and jutty his confounded base, swilled with the wild and wasteful ocean. Isn't that a beautiful bit of imagery? There's a lot of similes going on here. Imagine hearing this. Not only is Henry trying to build up the troops, to incite them to be stern, determined, violent in their rage, he's giving them the images in their mind to do it. He says, lend the eye a terrible aspect. In other words, you know, we talk about a piercing eye, or if looks could kill, a piercing aspect. It's so focused on what it wants that it pierces, it stares through you to get to its goal. And then he likens it to something. He says, let it pry through the portage of the head. Well, this portage is a hole. And in the front of our skull, we have the eye sockets. So they're the portage or the ports of the head. And it says, let the eye pry through, poke through like a brass cannon. So it is staring in warfare. It is staring in violence and, as he said before, in rage. This focus as if about to charge a shot from the eye. Then he mentions the brow. And this is a very brilliant image for a couple of reasons. He says, let the brow overwhelm it. That's overwhelm the eye. So if the brow is to overwhelm the eye, it has to stick out further. He says actually, overhang as fearfully as doth a gold rock overhang and jutty his confounded base. What that means is, have you ever seen a rock where it's gold at the bottom? That is, the sea has eaten underneath a cliff, and you have this overhang of the cliff. It sort of sticks out, jutty or juts out. Saying, let your brow jut over your eyes. So the eyes are now focused, piercing like a cannon from the head, and the brow is jutting over them. So the head is tilted. What's that ready for? It's a charge, isn't it? We're ready to charge in. Stiffen sinews, with the blood raised. Let the head jut over the eyes, which are like cannons from the head. And of course, he's making this feeling of energy build in the troops, because you imagine the confounded base of a cliff. So the cliff confounded, struck from all sides. The water's hitting a cliff so violently, booming up. That's the energy within the men's chest booming up beneath the brow that's leant forward. And he says, swilled with the wild and wasteful sea. Now, there's a particularly interesting point about this phrase. Swilled with the wild and wasteful ocean, I think it was. So swilled, churned around, swilled water, like around the base of a cliff. And wasteful, it devastates, and it keeps going on, so relentless. So he's giving this idea that you soldiers, you'll be relentlessly pouring through the breach, or you'll be swilling around in the hole where the breach is, at the bottom of the wall. You'll be swilling there, maybe fighting for some time, but like the tide, you'll be cutting it away. In the beginning of this scene, it says soldiers enter with ladders. So while they attack the actual breach, the hole in the wall, a lot of the defenders of the town will have to meet them, and it may leave some of the wall empty, and other soldiers will climb on top of it. Now imagine if you're a soldier that gets on top of the wall at Harfleur and you look down upon the morass of fighting people in that tight quarter of the breach in the wall. What would it look like? It may even sound like the sea as it swirls and lays waste to one another beneath your feet. You are on this wall jutting over the top. What a brilliant image of battle and warfare. What's Henry doing? He's putting these images into the minds of the men who are about to charge. You know, we talk about, if you want to achieve something, envision the goal. Henry's doing that in the most powerful of language. Don't you find that remarkable? Let's carry on and see what he says next. Now set the teeth and stretch the nostril wide. Hold hard the breath and bend up every spirit to his full height. So set the teeth and flare the nostrils wide. So you clench your teeth and then flare your nostrils. You're really determined. You're gritty now. There is nothing going to push you back. Hold hard the breath and bend up every spirit. So when you're in a straining match, say a tug of war, or if you were to be pushing against another person, you actually hold your breath, don't you, to make yourself more rigid. So in other words, Henry is saying, put everything into this. Because remember how he started? Once more unto the breach. He's almost saying this one last push will do it. Give it everything you've got and we'll get through. Now Henry moves on to the emotional appeal. He does this in the speech at Agincourt as well. He calls on the idea of honour and nobility. And he lets the common yeomanry, that's the common countryman of the army. That's the common countrymen from home who make up most of the army. He gives them the idea that they are being as noble as the dukes and the king himself around them, that they are a band of brothers. They're all equal on the field of battle. Look what he says. On, you noble English, whose blood is fet from fathers of war proof. On. So they've already begun to charge. He's rallying them. Come on, keep going. He's really behind them. And he says, you noble English. He's appealing to patriotism. Between the hundreds of years that France and England were at war, most of the time it was the English invading France, and the English felt proud of the fact that they often took the battle to the French. So now he's saying, go on. And he says, whose blood, so the blood that runs in your veins, is fet or fetched from fathers war-proof. Now, when he says fathers that are war-proof, he doesn't mean they're like bulletproof or war can't get to them. It means they have been proved in war. You can, when we're making a sword, for instance, you can proof the steel. It makes it hard. He's saying the blood in your veins comes from fathers who had their blood proved strong in war themselves. And of course, there's a history to this. Henry V, his campaign would see probably the last great battle of a bunch of great battles that the English had won over the French. Before this one, you had the Battle of Crécy, the Battle of Poitiers, in which the English had really outdone themselves and beaten the French. Henry's appealing to that. This is a living history. It's in the living memory of some of them. Their dads were fighting there, or their grandparents were fighting. He's saying, on you noble English, whose blood that runs in you comes from the fathers who fought on the fields of Crécy. You now have to uphold that. And he hammers this point home, really making them feel not only the idea of nobility, but a sense of duty to their own kin back home. Because he says, fathers, that, if you can hear splattering, by the way, it's raining chronic outside. Fathers that like so many Alexanders have in these parts from morn till even fought, and sheathed their swords for lack of argument. What's he saying? Your fathers like so many Alexanders. Now, what was Alexander called? What was his epithet? The Great. Henry is saying, your fathers were great. They were like so many Alexanders. Now it's your turn. Will your blood run in you as proof as theirs was? And then he says that their fathers had fought in these parts, that is in France, from morn till even. So from morn till even fought. So from the morning to the nightfall, they have fought solid in some battles, and they've sheathed their swords only for want of argument. In other words, they've run out of people to fight. They've only put their swords away because they've killed everyone on the field. It's took all day, and they would have carried on if there was anyone else to fight, to argue with in combat. Do you see how motivating this must be to the sons and grandsons who have stood before the walls of Harfleur, trying to get in? It's a daunting prospect. Harfleur was immensely fortified, a very difficult town to take, and it must have been scary to go towards it. But now you want to go. You've got a family history to uphold. He carries on. He turns to the mothers now. No one wants to upset their mother. So he says, dishonour not your mothers. Now attest that those whom you call fathers did beget you. Be copy now to men of grosser blood, and teach them how to war. We'll stop at that. Did you see that rhythmic, that pounding, 3 different strikes of the same note? Dishonour not your mothers. This idea of honour. On noble English. And your fathers were like so many Alexanders, great rulers of the world. He's elevating them. Dishonour not your mothers. Let not your mothers feel shame if you were to move back from this, to cower from the fight and go home without any victory. And then he says, now attest, that is, prove to everyone, that those whom you call your fathers are in fact your fathers, did beget you. He's saying, you say you have these fathers at home who fought at Crécy, who fought at Poitiers, who have fought in the French campaigns, who go right back in history. Prove that they are your fathers by being like them. What a motivating speech. He hammers the third point home by saying, be copy to men of grosser blood. So it doesn't mean copy people who are lesser than you. The copy, the writing, be the instructions in your actions now on the field of battle for men who are lesser than you, of grosser blood, so that those can feel ashamed of themselves and know how to war, to how to be men. You can be the example to all men back in England. That's what he's saying. So he's motivating them. He's basically saying, if you fight with me once more into the breach, if you muster up every sinew and all the blood and the rage, if you focus those cannon-like eyes, if you tip the head forward in a charge, then you will be like the great fathers you had. You'll be noble. You'll be able to go home with your head held high. If you don't do this, you're a total disappointment to everyone. You're a waste. You're a coward. How can this person listen to this and then not charge without feeling completely cowardly? You can't. So it's a brilliant inspirational speech. He makes them believe they can, but he also makes them believe that they can't not do it. Let's see how he carries on talking to these ones. And you, good yeoman. So yeoman is the common folk. Often we talk of the yeomanry as the archers. But it's not necessarily just the archers. It's the common folk. A yeoman worked the land or the forests. You, good yeoman, whose limbs were made in England, show us here the mettle of your pasture. Let us swear that you are worth your breeding, which I doubt not. We'll just stop. Good yeoman whose limbs were made in England. What's so beautiful about this is the yeomanry, as I've just mentioned, are frequently linked to the archers. And of course, it was the archers at Agincourt that gained the name of saving England. So, and all men back in England had to train from boyhood to shoot the bow. It says, whose limbs were made in England. Now, the limbs we use for fighting, but it also harkens to the limbs of a tree. Particularly the mighty yew tree, because the yew tree was used to make the longbow. So when he says good yeoman whose limbs were made in England, they probably picture the powerful limbs of very strong trees. He's saying you're like that. You are superhuman. Okay, draw your bows with strength. And then says, show us here the mettle of your pasture. So if you've got a pasture, you want it to be a fine pasture. If you work your land correctly, you can make the soil and loam even better. And he's saying where you came from, your lineage, your fathers, were they the Alexanders that I've mentioned, or were they nobodies? Prove the mettle, prove the worth, the constitution of your pasture, where you come from, by what you do here. And that you're worth your breeding. You know, that you are a thoroughbred. You're not some runt who's just come along to tag with the army for free pay and food. But you can prove your breeding. You are a thoroughbred warrior from a lineage of warriors. And Henry says, which I doubt not. You see, he's careful not to be accusative. He uses the incitement of not letting one's family or country down, but he doesn't accuse them of being cowards. He says, I know you to be brave men. Imagine the king saying that to you. You've got something to live up to. You're not being chastised. So they want to prove their worth to Henry. Then he carries on right towards the end now. For there is none of you so mean and base that hath not noble lustre in your eyes. There's none of you so mean and base. Mean and base doesn't mean like they're horrible, vile, ugly creatures. Mean and base means the lowest of the social hierarchy. You could just be some kind of cottager or serf. But he's saying there's none of you so mean that I can't see nobleness in your eyes. You look like a nobleman because of your courage, because of your determination, because of the great feats you are about to perform, to continue your family's reputation, which has gone back centuries of being brave and active warriors. I can see the nobility in your eyes, even if you do come from a lower background. Not today, you're not. Today, you are with me. You're my brother. And then he comes out with one of the great phrases in Shakespearean speech. And it gives you an idea of how the men have already reacted to his speech. They're just waiting for him to finish now. And he just gives them that one last image to make them sort of shout huzzah and go running towards the walls of Harfleur. He says, "I see you stand like greyhounds in the slips, straining upon the start. The game's afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon this charge cry, God for Harry, England, and St. George." So he says, I see you standing like greyhounds in the slips. Think of the dog races, which was common back then. Greyhounds were fast, and you had them in their little slips, their little channels before the race started with the gates in front. He says, I see you like greyhounds. You're champing, you're fidgeting, ready for the start. What does he say? Straining on the start, getting ready for the start. As soon as those doors are lifted, off they go, and there's no bringing them back. He says, I see you like that. Then he says, the game's afoot. So we're on the 3, 2, 1, start. But when he says the game's afoot, he could be playing on the idea of the hunt. So the game animals who are afoot, they are fleet, they have broken their cover and are running, and it's time to chase. Also, what was it that made the dogs run on the dog race? It was a rabbit that was let go, or sometimes a larger animal. So when that was let go and was running, the greyhounds would chase. And that's what it's saying. The game is afoot. Harfleur is the prize. It's broken down. There is a breach. Go, run into it like greyhounds from the slips. Can you see in this the irresistible power of language when it is used well? Imagine if people spoke like this today, what could be done? Because you see, we think in pictures, yes, but with words. And those words which make the pictures determine the caliber or the significance or the ardor with which we pursue something. So imagine learning to think like this, what you could accomplish. And then he said, didn't he, follow your spirit. In other words, now that you are charged up, none of that stillness and humility. Wherever you turn, you just go with your spirit and let your energy and your might and the stiffened sinews and the raised blood take you where it will. I trust in you. And then he says, and upon this charge. So I'm about to give the signal. And when I give the signal, cry all together, God for Harry. Harry is Henry V. England and St. George, the patron saint of England. And then can you imagine, Henry says, go, the trumpet blasts that war alarum, and can you imagine the roar of the thousands of men who then tip forward, determined to get into that city? It would have been terrifying to be on the receiving end of it. But you see how he's lifted the spirits through language of men who must be looking at the amount of dead bodies already in the breach of Harfleur, because he said once more into the breach. There's already been some there and repulsed. They might be thinking at the beginning, we'll never get through this. But now Henry has roused them to the point of thinking, we can't fail. And they just charge forward. So that is the brilliance of language. And that is why I like to cover Shakespeare, because there is literally no writer who has lived on earth who could do with language what Shakespeare's done. So now, for the fun of it, let's try and read through this in its entirety so we get it, rather than broken up, we get it all in its fine glory. Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. In peace, there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger. Stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-favoured rage, then lend the eye a terrible aspect. Let it pry through the portage of the head like the brass cannon. Let the brow overwhelm it as fearfully as doth a gold rock overhang and jutty his confounded base, swilled with the wild and wasteful ocean. Now set the teeth and stretch the nostrils wide. Hold hard the breath and bend up every spirit to his full height. On! On, you noble English, whose blood is fet from fathers of war proof. Fathers that, like so many Alexanders, have in these parts from morn till even fought, and sheathed their swords for lack of argument. Dishonour not your mothers. Now attest that those whom you call fathers did beget you. Be copy now to men of grosser blood, and teach them how to war. And you, good yeomen whose limbs were made in England, show us here the mettle of your pasture. Let us swear that you are worth your breeding, which I doubt not. For there is none of you so mean and base that hath not noble lustre in your eyes. I see you stand like greyhounds in the slip, straining upon the start. The game's afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon the charge cry God for Harry, England, and St. George. You gotta love Shakespeare. He's absolutely brilliant. Well, I want to recommend to you again, as I did in another video, if you haven't done it, get Shakespeare out and shout it at a wall and watch what happens to your soul from the words. They are outstanding. And when you do this, if you do that one exercise, I guarantee you it will click why you should be into Shakespeare. You'll think, my days, nothing has come close to this. You literally are opened up as a human being, and the whole power and energy that we all have in us is released through words like these. So I hope you've enjoyed this. If you like the classics, classic literature, and going into Shakespeare in depth, then please hit the subscribe button, and especially can you hit like, because it does me the world of good, and leave a comment about what you thought. And if you did shout at the wall with a speech, how did it go for you? How did it feel? I wish you joy in your reading.